Survival horror is one of the hardest genres to understand for some. After all, you have to balance making a game fun while also making it tense and scary. During the 90s and 2000s, survival horror was a genre constantly getting filled with new ideas and different groups trying their damnedest to be the next Silent Hill. It was kind of crazy to think about considering how homogenized the genre has become in recent years, but it really felt like creative horror was everywhere. But I personally never got into it. You see, it was always I've been through this charade 2 times already, let's just skip the preamble. For the last month or so, I've been playing survival horror classics. Despite my hesitation, I found 2 new favorites, and have been playing a lot of these series in my off time. It was insane to me just how wrong I was to hesitate when it came to this genre. I was so worried that the gameplay would be unfun or clunky, or I'd get lost constantly, or that I would just get infuriated, but instead, I found genuinely fantastic experiences. One for more action-focused gameplay, and one for more puzzle-focused, defensive combat-style gameplay. I felt like I had been completely duped, thinking all of these games would be painful slogs I despise. But I was wrong, and I can now say that I am a fan of classic survival horror. But I feel like I exaggerated the word of mouth portion of my hesitance. Yes, the way people describe these games didn't make them sound fun, and that did keep me away, but that was just me using a confirmation bias, honestly. I had already been poisoned away from this genre, due to both a mistake on my part, but also due to just how rough my first experience with the genre was. A game that completely took what I was worried these games might be, and absolutely confirmed how bad they were, and then some. It's the game that turned me away from survival horror, but also one I couldn't take my eyes off the screen during. But enough setup. It's time to whine about Rule of Rose. Now, I'm sure you have questions. Why make a video on such a niche, barely touched on horror game? Why waste time and effort about how a game hurt my feelings when nobody really gives a shit? Well, call it restitution. I know this video won't get many eyes on it, but I'll be damned if I didn't end this short marathon of celebrating survival horror without finally digging into the game that gave me the disdain for the genre I've had for years. Another question you might have might be, why, of all games, did you start with Rule of Rose? Well, a few reasons. One, I'm a massive hipster, and I'm the type to start with a weird cult classic than one of the actual time-tested classics. Second, the story. From the second I saw the opening, I was captivated, and we will get to that. But when you hear people talk about Rule of Rose, at least if they're being positive, it is focused on the story, the dark themes, the fantastic presentation. And I was very interested in those things. I love when a game has a story that really stands out, so this game had me hooked. And hell, it's the reason I even pushed enough to finish it in the first place. But we're not starting with the story. We will get to it, but I need you to understand why, despite having one of the best stories in survival horror, this game is kind of a train wreck that I can't stand. But first, let's be nice. The presentation is fantastic. While yes, I am using a mod that pushes the game into 1080p and really makes it look pretty, despite the hiccups on some of the models and faces, but even without this mod, the game looks great. I love how lived in every environment is, how every room of the blimp feels like it has purpose, while also having each room mesh into one another in strange ways due to the game's dreamlike nature. The way everything oozes its time period, the way the blimp feels claustrophobic yet massive and empty all at the same time. The transitions from the blimp to the orphanage and back again always feel jarring, yet never in a way that takes you out, more in a way that makes you wonder what's real. That's where I think these visuals really nail it, because the game is a jumbled mess of nightmares and memories all swirling together in ways that don't make any sense, yet you can also tell when something is a much more direct translation of what happened. The game is full of FMVs too, which for a game I at least assume was made with a budget is really impressive to see, and the natural transition near the end of the game where it goes from a memory in which adult Jennifer is placed to a full recreation of what happened is not only powerful from a story perspective, but also incredibly well done. Jennifer, despite being an adult surrounded by kids, always feels so tiny and is always positioned camera-wise to make her feel insignificant. Meanwhile, here, we see her as a small child. Despite not even being taller than most of the kids here, she takes over the frame, finally taking back power, and the cutscene expresses that incredibly well. And what's great is most of these FMVs are like that. The way Stray Dog is portrayed in pure shadow and low to the ground while this tiny child commands your attention. Every scene where they do the childish punishments, while not inherently disturbing, are shot in ways that make your spine tingle. I should mention, this game is never really scary, but it does set out to disturb more than scare, and I think the presentation goes along with that. There's nothing super terrifying on a normal horror level, just concepts or implications, and what the presentation does really well is never showing its full hand. It implicates, it shows subtle movements in the characters, and it keeps the expert subtlety that the storytelling has. has. Along with that, you have one of the most unique horror game soundtracks I've ever heard. Again, I don't think it brings out any terror, but the tone the game sets is one of uncomfortable melancholy. To match both that and add to the location and time period, this game's soundtrack has a heavy focus on strings. These songs are absolutely gorgeous. I think they're a little short and loop a little too often, especially the orphanage theme, but all of them sound so beautiful that it's really hard to get sick of them. They add to the dreamlike atmosphere as these tragic yet somewhat whimsical sounding compositions quietly play in the background. It also tends to feel like it always matches Jennifer's mental state. When you're alone and aimless, the music tends to have less instruments, but when you have a goal, or when you're with Brown, it fills out a bit. Meanwhile, when encountering enemies, it sounds like the music itself is beginning to crack, similar to my controller at the time. Sorry. Positivity. The orphanage theme, as tedious and annoying as it can get, has a cloudy, scratchy sound, as if you're finally digging into the roughest aspects of Jennifer's mind and just barely grasping on. Even the game's main theme, which I don't know if I'm allowed to play, has this haunting, sad sound to it that always sticks with me whenever I hear it. It's beautiful, but deeply uncomfortable, which the rest of the soundtrack follows suit with. You can tell they really wanted this game to have an atmosphere unlike anything else out there, and the music is the biggest example of that. It's melancholic, it's beautifully made, and is one of the best parts of the game. Now, why am I gushing about the presentation and music after all the buildup of me getting ready to piss and moan about the game? Well, it's because it's those things that the game uses to lie to you. Because the game starts out so good because of those things. I mean it. If I'm just going by how the game starts, it is damn near perfect. The trek to the orphanage with the sounds leading you along, the characters peeking over the wall as if they've been waiting for you to get there, the burial sequence up to the blimp, it's all so captivating. And then once you're on the blimp, after a legitimately uncomfortable introduction by our captor, you get time to explore the blimp for a bit, running into an occasional character, exploring rooms, learning about giving gifts to the club, as this absolutely gorgeous, sad, haunting cello solo plays in the background. It creates this odd feeling of not being in danger, but feeling like the odd one out. Nobody wants to talk to you, and if they do, it's insults whispered under their breath. The one friendly face you see is your dog Brown, who starts off tied up, meaning even the one bit of comfort you have starts as a discomfort. It's that feeling of, despite being surrounded by people, you are completely, utterly alone. It's one of the most incredible hooks a horror game has, in my opinion, and this is before the game's story or cutscenes have even gotten into full swing. It's so good, it's so engaging and immersive, and then the first enemy shows up and everything goes downhill. I'm not exaggerating or kidding. This game never, ever hits these heights ever again, because it's once you fight that enemy that the game actually starts, and it continuously gets worse from here. See, that first fight is kind of nothing, but it does clue you in from second one that, oh, this game's combat controls suck, and you realize how clunky and awful it feels just to move around. It was never an issue before, as you were free to wander around, encouraged to go into different rooms and to explore, but here, once there's actual stakes and you have to move in certain ways, the controls fucking blow. This game uses the same camera angles and camera styles as Silent Hill, and I know it is not kind to make this comparison, but honestly, the gameplay is asking for it. The difference being, though, this game doesn't have tank controls, and it doesn't even have an option for them. This is a huge problem, as why, yes, tank controls can be hard to get the hang of. When the camera angle changes constantly, having your directions not change in kind works best. It makes things feel smooth, as if the camera angles kept changing like this and you had normal controls, that'd just get annoying, especially when things like enemies or similar looking hallways get involved, right? Wouldn't it be crazy if this game had no actual compromises when it came to these angles, and the angles did nothing but inconvenience and annoy you? Wouldn't it be annoying if, due to these angles, fighting bosses and crowds of enemies became extremely frustrating? Yes, it would. And it is. And it sucks. The camera angles are neat for a second, but once you realize every time it changes, you have to do miniature adjustments in order to do something as simple as moving forward, they immediately lose all charm and just become annoying. Not helping is that if you accidentally get disoriented, everything about the movement already feels awful. The movement is so sluggish and slow. To call it a slight jog would be a massive over-exaggeration. It makes combat incredibly frustrating, as if you get cornered or need to adjust adjust, you have to slowly meander over or, God forbid, do this dumbass turn at times. Yes, there's a quick turnaround, but that doesn't matter when the game's only form of combat encounters is just overwhelming you. If this was Silent Hill or Resident Evil, you could at least run away or get into a better position. Here, good luck getting anywhere without getting hit, because the most Jennifer can do in terms of movement speed is this pathetic Cupid shuffle. This, of course, isn't health, because the combat in this game is straight up unacceptably awful. I guess they really wanted you to feel like a skinny British girl in the 1940s, because Jennifer in terms of combat is a complete embarrassment. I'd say it's funny, but that would mean I'm taking anything positive from this combat system. Your range, whether it's with a fork or a long pipe, is basically nothing. I have no idea how it exactly works, but it feels like a hitbox actually showing up on these weapons is a goddamn coin flip. You can be inside of an enemy and your attacks will still whip, which isn't a good thing because of the next issue the combat has, which is the enemies themselves. See, if this game handled enemies how other games do, as in one, maybe two, very rarely three at a time in a wide open space, it'd be a joke, because for the most part, enemies in this game struggle to do anything. But don't worry, the designers realized this, but instead of doing anything to make an individual enemy intimidating, they shoved crowds of them in every crevice they could. If this game decides enemies are going to appear, that means every corner of every room and one every 5 steps in every hallway. It's not difficult, it's not scary, it is just annoying, as you have to try to bob and weave with the most sluggish and mild-paced power walking possible. Meanwhile, they can get in pot shots, and God help you if you get hit, because while you have flinch animations, there's no invincibility frame, so if one hits you and slows you down, that's a potential stun lock from other enemies. And I hope for your sake you don't accidentally approach a locked door or dead end, because they will respond by forming walls you can't get past without at least trying to engage in the combat, which means more unnecessary damage and frustration. I didn't avoid enemies out of choice or to stay safe. I avoided enemies because their placement was never thought out past crowd goes here. There's no choice in the matter. It's either run or get bludgeoned over and over again while trying to get tiny hits off yourself. Though the game knows you might be avoiding enemies to try and keep any sort of potential fun you were having going, and we can't have that, so there are many times where the game will force you into combat, and what a shock, these do not feel thought out in the slightest. Yes, game, please, shove me in a tiny space with 4 enemies I can't dodge. Please, game, do it again with 5 enemies 2 seconds later, after the last 2 gauntlets drained my health. Whenever that dumbass animation of a door locking played, there was never a point where I tensed up, never a point where I was scared, just a long, heavy sigh as I had to deal with shit I had no control over. And this is where this game's combat truly fails, because in other games I've played this month, if I fucked up during combat, it was my fault. I made a mistake, I was too aggressive, I wasn't ready, that sort of thing. But here, it's the exact opposite. It feels like I'm spinning a wheel every time I swing my weapon. Meanwhile, every time my weapon just ignores an enemy, I get to enjoy hit after hit after hit. And you better hope Brown doesn't get knocked out, because not only are his healing items exceptionally rare, if he's down, good luck solving any puzzles left in the chapter. And what's hilarious is that I could still probably get over these shitty encounters. Yes, they are garbage, completely unfair most of the time, but the game decided to one-up itself with the boss fights. I've made it pretty clear that I haven't usually cared for the boss fights in these games. I think they're nothing at best, annoying at worst, but here, they are some of the worst I have ever experienced in a video game. They are everything about this game's combat made even worse. So let's take a look at these genius fights, shall we? What I love about these bosses is that they just can do shit. Like, you can be behind them, completely avoiding them, but nope, you got hit, idiot. The issue of your weapons not hitting? Even worse here, as despite these bosses having massive frames, their hitboxes are minuscule to straight up non-existent. What I think the game wants you to do is avoid their attacks, then get up close and punish them. But that'd be too simple if it just worked, because for one, when an enemy starts to attack, they immediately have a hitbox all over their body, no matter where you are, and sometimes the hitbox just stays there after the animation is done. Second, if an enemy is doing an animation, their hurtbox disappears. Where'd it go? It's spooky. Meanwhile, you, again, have no invincibility frames. You can always be hit, and these enemies can attack out of hit stun before your swing animation is even done. And to add even more more salt onto this gaping wound. They have so much HP. Like, hit them 20 or more times HP. Meanwhile, you will die in seconds to some of these. The Hoffman boss fight immediately lets you know how awful the boss fights are. His range is ridiculous. He's rarely vulnerable, and if he is, he will gladly hit you immediately in return. This is also where you'll notice how irritating being knocked down is, as it happens often and it takes an eternity to stand back up. And don't worry, he can immediately hit you the second your hitbox is back up, knocking you down again and potentially locking you for a guaranteed death if he feels like it. The mermaid princess is somehow just as bad. She's only vulnerable when she's near the ground, but just like Hoffman, she can hit you from anywhere. And if she uses her vomit attack, that's instantly either a guaranteed prolonging of the fight, as you can't go near her, or an instant death, because until the vomit is completely gone, that's a hitbox. And even better, it'll hit you over and over and over and over and over and over if you so much tiptoe in it. Such an absolute waste of an incredibly uncomfortable design. And Stray Dog is just, I don't know, man. He's got the same issues, but I was so over the game at this point, I couldn't be bothered to get frustrated anymore. After the massive amount of combat encounters the last area forces you to do, I was just tapped out. It didn't really matter. I just wanted the game to be over, and I honestly didn't care anymore. I have to wonder, who the hell playtested this combat? It is never fun. It is never engaging. It's just praying and hoping your attacks do anything while the enemy's attacks constantly spam at you and wear you down. I didn't even mention how if you take too much damage, your slow trudge turns into a pathetically insignificant limp, meaning if you're still fighting, that's a guaranteed loss basically, and if you're exploring, Jesus Christ, man. In what universe is this considered acceptable? I hope I'm making myself clear here. This is why I was hesitant to try other combat-focused survival horror, because this game's combat is so frustrating, so broken, that it just turned me off of the genre. It's Silent Hill's combat, but with no nuance, no strategy, and no working hitboxes. It is so awful that I've known people who dropped the game entirely because this was so infuriating. And you know what? I can't blame them. It is honestly that bad. And I'm not even completely done complaining. Yes, this is the absolute lowest part of the game, but the other part of the gameplay isn't very good either. Similar to Silent Hill, this game is very puzzle focused, but unlike Silent Hill, these are pretty lame. Let me give you an example of a puzzle. You find an item, you have Brown sniff it, then you find another item and have him sniff that, and then you find another item and Brown will sniff that, finally leading you to the end of the puzzle. Doesn't sound that bad? To be honest, it's not for one or two puzzles, but this is all the game has. I don't mind the sniff mechanic, as it means as long as you have Brown sniff key items, you don't really get lost. However, this being the only puzzle gets old really fast. You're constantly doing this in every single chapter, and if you're not, you're checking rooms for item until the game says you've collected enough. This wouldn't be as annoying if, again, you didn't pace around so ungodly slow. It means going back and forth as you get more items to sniff feel like a major drag, as it just means slowly dragging yourself from one place or another with very little variation. And if there is variation, it's an enemy encounter. Joy! This means the main loop of the game is either dull, tedious, or unplayably bad. Even the parts I like collecting items and the orphanage, are still a drag gameplay-wise, they're just interesting story-wise. This is really disappointing because, again, the game starts out so good. Even when I replayed it for this video, that first section had me asking myself if my past negative feelings were well-founded. But the second that first enemy shows up, everything just gets worse and worse. I love the opening because it's everything the game doesn't usually do. It's taking you through new area after new area, engaging you with mysteries and characters, where in the normal game, you're just backtracking over and over, begging for any actual story to happen so you can engage with something, as the gameplay just drags everything down. And that's what really bugs me. Not only that the gameplay is so weak, but that everything that holds this game back literally has to do with its genre. This game shouldn't have been a survival horror game. It's not scary, for one, but two, these mechanics literally only work to its detriment. The fixed camera, the combat, the annoying puzzle solving, the limited inventory, the backtracking, all of this does nothing but hamper the game as an experience. It's weird to say, but I honestly think that if this game was made today, it could get away being one of those walking simulators, a game that tells its story without a lot of major gameplay elements other than going from area to area. This game doesn't work when you just watch the cutscenes. I genuinely think the segments exploring the blimp and orphanage are necessary. However, the actual game you play during those is so unfun, I'd rather it all well just be like the opening, exploring a linear path with different things happening, but the game feels like it has to be a survival horror game and completely fails to do so. What's crazy is I replayed the intro again after finishing the game in order to get footage of the extra costumes, and I still enjoyed it despite being over everything. I said Silent Hill and Resident Evil were great because they had all of these moving parts working together to make something amazing, but in this game it feels like each part works against each other. The puzzle solving is hampered by the combat, the limited inventory adds literally nothing, as there's no guns so you won't be delegating slots for ammo, just replacing older weapons for new ones. The fixed camera adds nothing but frustration. The backtracking along with the slow walk speed drags the pace to a crawl. Everything works on paper separately, yet each one drags the game down just that much worse. People say this is a forgotten survival horror gem, but I heavily disagree, because where it fails most is when it tries to be a survival horror game instead of just trying to tell its story. A story that I think is absolutely engaging and fantastic. Rule of Rose is a game banned in a lot of countries. Now, this is mostly due to a misunderstanding, as it was for things like showing animal and child abuse among other things. The thing is, it's kind of funny it got banned for that, because while this game isn't opposed to themes of that sort, it never shows them outright. I think the writers knew if they just constantly shoved that stuff in your face, it'd create shock, yes, but not the kind they wanted. It would have the chance of turning into shock for shock's sake. Instead, it tackles these subjects with a lot of subtlety, but it also doesn't completely shy away from them. I feel like in a situation like this, it's easier to do nothing but imply and never outright say anything. But this game says a ton without resorting to just shocking imagery. Rule of Rose is simply about Jennifer re-experiencing moments of her childhood. She's 19 when the game takes place, but the years she spent in the orphanage have defined her, and she dwells on them so much that she's reliving them in a mismatched cluster of moments and emotions. Despite only being on one for a short time, she associates the time she spent in the orphanage with the airship that took her parents away from her. The Aristocrat Club goes from what was a petty club of children making a facsimile of what they thought adult society was like, to a towering, unshakable hierarchy that it seems none of the adults even know is real. In the game, you're told that if you don't give a gift every month to the Aristocrat Club, they'll kill you. In reality, I don't think that was actually the case. We see the punishments they exact on people, and while these are uncomfortable for adults and would have been horrifying for children, they're not anything close to actually killing you. But what Jennifer felt back then was that if she didn't do what they said, they would kill her. They might as well. It doesn't help that the other children, and especially the adults, do not show her any time of day. The only positivity she gets are Brown, her dog, and Wendy, who we'll get to. The fact that we get hints of what's happening in the other characters' lives, but never much outside of those hints, also works really well. These are Jennifer's memories alone, so how could she fully understand what Hoffman was doing to Clara or the different relationships of the other kids? I've always looked at the things explored, like Meg's feelings for Diana, or the fact that we don't know exactly why the aristocrats killed Eleanor's bird, or why Eleanor didn't react to the loss of her pet at all, and tends to be emotionally shut off as a whole, and always had a lot of questions about it. And I've always appreciated that I had those questions, because Jennifer probably does too. She was never able to get to know the girls that well, so by that metric, we only see snippets. We assume the girls killed the bird because they're so twisted they just wanted Jennifer to get in trouble. But what if that's not the case? What if they discovered the bird dead and were afraid to tell Eleanor? Hell, the most obvious example is the adults. The game states that they simply left, but Jennifer clearly isn't sure if that's the case. Maybe she saw something she shouldn't have. Maybe the adults were murdered, or maybe they did just abandon the kids and Jennifer would rather believe that the club killed them than imagine that they just abandoned all of these children. We also know that Jennifer feels helpless towards these memories. She's an adult during them, but she looks and acts powerless. She might as well be an ant. But the one memory she can handle is the one time she stood up for herself, and therefore, she sees it exactly how it was. She's a kid here. There's nothing extreme or dreamlike about the scene, and this is the only memory that she can face fully. And it's the fact that she remembered this moment that allows her to start to come to grips of what happened. Jennifer is constantly referred to by the narrative as unlucky, as if she was just cursed to have bad things happen to her. And you know what? Unlucky really is the word to use here. Her parents' death on the blimp was out of her control. Her surviving just to be kidnapped was also out of her control. The fact that the girl who saved her life and who she fell in love with was an obsessive little monster, also not something a child could anticipate. I think that's why Jennifer is so stuck in this period of her life. She couldn't do anything about it, yet she's going over the situation in her head countless times because maybe there was something she could have done. That's why she can look back on that one moment as it happened, as that was the one time she took control, but it was also the same time that she lost the only comfort she had, both Brown and Wendy. Brown is a flawless being who I adore. I'm very biased, I adore dogs, so every time he was on screen, my violent anger towards the game went down by 2%, and it also helps that he aids in the story a lot. Brown, being a dog, is incredibly loyal to Jennifer. He adores her, and he's about the only creature around these kids that doesn't hate Jennifer. Wendy was Jennifer's young love. After the crash, Jennifer was kidnapped by a man named Gregory. Gregory had no true ill will towards her, but he was a broken man who had lost his mind after the death of his son, and because Jennifer kind of looked like him, in his delusion, he kidnapped her. Jennifer can't leave because obviously this man is incredibly unstable and has a gun, and Jennifer was just a kid. However, she had Wendy. Wendy saw Jennifer, and as they interacted, they fell in love, with Wendy taking Gregory's gun so that Jennifer could safely leave. The issue is, while Brown's love is genuinely pure and unconditional, Wendy's was obsessive. Jennifer made one promise to Wendy and one to Brown. To Wendy, everlasting true love. I am yours. And to Brown, to protect him until the day she dies. While to Jennifer, she could keep both. To Wendy, if she wouldn't only keep the one to her, she wasn't going to keep either. And this is where that subtlety really works in the game's favor. You're constantly giving hints of what they did, hints that Brown is dead, but the game doesn't show them killing him. It never shows the actual body. It just builds up to what you know is the truth, that he's gone. The moment leading up to it is brilliant. You keep hallucinating his body only to see it's just dolls the kids have laid out to tease you. It feels like you're walking through this brutal panic attack. And I think that what Wendy killing Brown and leading the aristocrats really sets in stone is just how horribly petty this all is, and why the game had to be done with children. Kids are incredibly petty. The smallest slight or bit of loneliness feels like the biggest issue in the world. You're not old enough to really understand how the world works, how to handle being hurt, or how to deal with emotions. The adults are either non-caring, abusive, or straight up gone in this scenario, so the kids begin running a version of society that caters to them, one that doesn't really make sense, and one that runs on pettiness, grudges, and insecurity. Reasonably, if someone spent less time with you because they have a pet now, we would shrug, accept that we can't be everything in someone's life, and keep moving. To a kid like Wendy, though, that's unacceptable. The idea that she can't be the center of attention sets her off. The reason that the aristocrats exist is to give Wendy control over others who are also immature, in a bad situation, and who are vulnerable, and target their frustrations at the quote-unquote lower class. Originally, that's Amanda, a girl who very clearly suffers from insecurity and instability and will do anything to get validation from others. But below her is Jennifer. This gives those who are broken power, and those without power a desperation to gain it by also ganging up on Jennifer. Yet Jennifer always has Brown. She has this slight bit of joy that unconditionally loves her, so they have to take that away too. But this is where Jennifer can't take it anymore. She has nothing to ground her, so she finally breaks, taking Wendy down and going at the others as well. I think it's interesting that we only get one scene of Jennifer after she had taken over the club. I don't think that her reign literally only lasted like 3 days, but I think to Jennifer, that time in her life doesn't matter. She had lost her only friends, and while yes, she got along with the others now, that didn't really matter. Time just passed until the final massive bout of trauma when Wendy returned. Wendy goes back to Gregory, more than likely as he was trying to take his own life, and manipulated and broke him further until there was nothing left. This is where her pettiness that had already gone way too far fully overflowed into pure maliciousness and evil. Even if she didn't mean for it to go as far as she did, she still planned to sick a broken man onto children who couldn't fight back, and it ended with all of them getting killed. That last moment of guilt and apology coming far too late. But I think what this also is a full seal on Jennifer never leaving these moments and memories behind. Every time she had anything positive, it was stolen from her. First her parents, then Brown, now every orphan except for her. It's the final guarantee that she could never be free. But this is where the game also contradicts that, saying it's not true, as during the final boss with Stray Dog Gregory, Brown breaks through the window and aids you. This obviously didn't happen in reality, but to me, this is Jennifer seeing all of this negativity, damn near getting swallowed by it, before that glimmer of hope that was always there finally comes back to her. Brown is gone, yes, but he never did anything wrong to her. It hurts that he was taken away, but she can always look back on the time with him as something special. And that's where that ending comes in. Jennifer is moving on. She can't undo what happened, but she can know that it wasn't her fault. She can move past the survivor's guilt and keep the memories that she treasures close to her. It's why that section with her as a kid is like that. I don't think Wendy stood there at the gate when she walked away, but it's Jennifer metaphorically saying, no, you aren't the part of my past I want to keep, and that Wendy's obsession doesn't matter now. But she can always return to that puppy she found in the shed, that friend that kept her going, and whose death pushed her into taking control for the first time. And when she wakes up, she's ready to push forward as an adult, no longer held back by those memories, and ready to live a positive future. In 1940s London, right before the Blitz, god damn it. I love how this game tells its story, and I also love that it has a reason to use the subject matter it does. A lot of what's talked about here is inherently dark, childhood abuse, animal death, and in some cases how Jennifer saw grooming and assault but didn't put it together in her head. All of that stuff is rough, but the game doesn't just use them to get a rise out of you. It'd be so easy for them to just show this stuff on the screen while going, man, isn't this fucked up? But it instead tackles it in a very mature way. It doesn't mire in metaphor or insinuation, but it also doesn't shove it in your face demanding you to be shocked. It's a story full of mature subject matter, handled in a mature way. It's a story that the developers very obviously wanted to be out there, and as a whole, I'm at least glad the story in this game exists. And now, I'm sure a lot of you are expecting that this is the part of the video where I say, yeah, the gameplay's a little rocky, but the story is so good that the game is still worth playing. But no, absolutely not. Yes, this story is something special. One of my favorites in all of survival horror and maybe all of gaming. But that doesn't matter that much if the story to get to each cutscene ranges from dull to infuriating. Other than the very beginning and the very end, this game's gameplay is a mess, and it completely ruins the enjoyment I wish this game could bring me. Hell, by the time I was in the orphanage segment, I was so fucking done with this game that despite loving the story moments here, I barely cared anymore, and that's really sad for me to say, because despite all of that bullshit, despite me grinding my teeth through each boring puzzle or broken boss fight, once the cutscenes started up, my eyes would be glued to the screen. And hell, the intro and epilogue are so good that I almost forgot I kind of hate this game. But the funny thing is, those are the moments where the game is linearly telling you its story with no actual survival horror mechanics at all. And that's why I think this game truly fails as a horror game. Everything about it that uses things from survival horror, whether it's puzzle solving, combat, or the camera, makes the game much, much worse. And yeah, I can completely see why this game turned me off from the genre, because it's everything in the genre that could go wrong, going wrong horribly. I pushed through back then because of the story, and I pushed through now because of the same reason, also for this video. And I can truly say, with more survival horror experience under my belt, this game is bad. Despite all of that, this game has given me an even deeper appreciation of the other games I've played this month. With this being the only one under my belt, I couldn't imagine ever enjoying a survival horror game like it, but that's why games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill should be celebrated. Things could have gone horribly wrong, but it felt like the developers had a deep understanding of how each little piece would fit together. Where here, it feels like they had this incredible script, but then realized, oh shit, we have to make a game around this. It doesn't feel like they understood what actually made those games both fun and scary. It's that despite the fact that you have control over situations, you're always stressing about resources, what's going to come next, or if you played the scenario correctly, along with some fun, brain-teasing puzzles to make it so combat isn't all there is. Where here, it felt like they saw the basic outline of enemy strong, player weak, also puzzles. And that's all that they use. It's unfortunate that this game ended up the way it did, too. These developers really wanted this game out there. It took them forever to get a publisher, and even then it had a very limited run. But it's just too messy for me to tell people that any of it is worth experiencing. What I would recommend is if you really want to experience the game's good parts, i.e. the story, the visuals, the music, and the atmosphere, use an invincibility cheat code or watch a friend play it, and laugh as they get frustrated over the gameplay while also engaging with the story. Also, for the love of God, emulate it. For one, save states are a godsend in these boss fights, and two, no game is worth this much money. Rule of Rose especially. It's weird. I don't think this game is worth playing, but at the same time, man, I really want people to experience its storytelling. I've seen people people in comment sections wishing it could get a TV series or a remake, but considering how small its following is, I don't see it happening. What I would personally want is for them to drop the survival horror angle and make it closer to a walking simulator or something similar. Yes, that could be disappointing for some people, but I just don't see how its genre currently benefits it. I just want the story to be told without all of the snags, without constant moments where players would want to just put the game down and not continue. I know this game has its fans, and to those people, I'm sorry if this wasn't the type of video you wanted to see. I wish I could be one of you. I wish I could champion this game as a hidden PS2 masterpiece that needs to be recognized by all. But with this gameplay, I'm sorry, I just can't. I hope I've at least made my point clear. Rule of Rose has become a weirdly important game to me, as both an example of how not to do horror, but also as an example of a game I constantly look at wishing it was better. I appreciate this game, I really do, but I really can't stand it either. I don't know, man. My words are meaningless, my goals are pointless, my life is a lie. The Uzumaki adaptations suck dick, I'm not coming back.